Chapter 2. My Father. I believe God has had his hand on my father and mother since they were born. Although I can only acquaint you with a tiny portion of how God has worked with my parents and spared them by his kindness, I do have on record some of the events as they have told them to me. If it had not been for God's faithfulness, I would not be here to share with you this walk with Jesus. It is truly only by God's grace that we have come this far. Dad never tired of telling me how God miraculously spared him from death when he was but a youngster. Daddy and Uncle Pete were going for gravel one day, he recalls, and you might remember the old gravel wagons. They were long, heavy-bedded constructions with huge wheels. One sat up pretty high in them. Well, I was sitting between Dad and Uncle Pete, and since I was only 2.5 to 3 years old, Daddy told his brother, "Now, Pete, I want you to take care of Eldon." So he was trying to hold on to me as we jolted along. Suddenly, with the big team pulling hard against that heavy load of gravel, the wheel came off on the right-hand side. The wagon dropped fast and hit the ground with such a jolt that Uncle Pete was hurled into the fence. I must have been thrown forward directly under the horses, because the first thing Pete remembers seeing when he stopped moving was the freshly shod hoof of the huge mare coming down right on my head. Of course, the horse was excited and nervous because of the accident. That hoof would have crushed my head like a mallet. But quicker than lightning, Uncle Pete told me, faster than I have ever moved, my hand shot out, grabbed hold of Eldon's foot, and pulled him out of the way just as the mare's hoof came down. He told me a number of times that something far beyond him helped him to get Dad out of there. Granddad had always chided Uncle Pete for being slow and pokey, but he never teased him again after that day. Dad was spared only through the mercies of the Lord. About a year or two later, my father experienced another miraculous deliverance from death, this time through prayer. When the large workhorse he was riding stumbled, Dad suffered a severe fall on his neck and back. At first, there didn't appear to be any permanent injury, but the next day, he experienced difficulty in walking. At evening time, while helping his father feed the pigs, his legs buckled under him. Unable to get up, he was carried to the house by his father. Dr. Chenoweth took much time in examining him, I understand, concluding that Dad had a creeping paralysis as a result of this fall. He informed my grandfather William and grandmother Esther Helm that their 6th child possibly might get better, but could get worse, and Dad's condition worsened. He began to lose the use of one part of his body and then of another. Soon he wasn't able to talk, and then he couldn't swallow. Though they kept him alive by injecting food and medicine into him, hardly a muscle of his body moved. Even his eyelids were lifeless. Only his breathing continued, slow and shallow. 3 doctors said that he could not live. But Dad had an aunt, his mother's sister, who lived 14 miles away in Muncie. Aunt Zelpy lived close to God. She talked with God. One day, she appeared at the farmhouse door. "The Holy Spirit has revealed to me," she told William and Esther, "that if I come and pray for Eldon's healing, he will live. William, would you have any objection if I pray for your son?" Grandfather replied, "No, Dr. Chenoweth and the other doctors have given him up. He is at the edge of death now." So I am told that Aunt Zelpy moved into the Helm household, spending most of her waking hours by my father's bedside. This was to be her vigil of intercessory prayer for days to come, an assignment she had never before attempted and was never called to repeat for anyone else in her lifetime. It is said that she would rub my father's frail body and pray until she would collapse to the floor in exhaustion. But in spite of her ministrations, his condition worsened. His flesh was hardly noticeable against the protruding frame of his skeleton. Uncle Pete shared with me, 50 years later, that on 3 occasions they called the family around my father's bedside. "If you want to see Eldon alive," they said, "you'll have to hurry, because it won't be long, and he will be gone." Yet he lived on, even when it became too painful to continue injecting him with food and medicine. One morning, God revealed to Aunt Zelpy that the boy would be healed if his mother would yield her heart to Jesus. She was thrilled with the revelation and tried to speak with her sister concerning her soul. But Esther seemed to sense something of the nature of Zelpy's purpose and managed to avoid her for some time. She would see her sister coming and go another way through the house. Finally, Aunt Zelpy confronted her at the door leading into the hallway. "Now, Esther," she said, "do you want this boy to live?" Of course, my grandmother was perturbed by this question and replied, "Why, yes, Zelpy, you know I do." "Well," her sister said, kindly but firmly, "you must give your life to Jesus so I can pray and have faith for this baby to be raised up." Immediately, Grandmother Esther dropped to her knees and asked Jesus to forgive her and come into her heart. Praying through to victory, she was converted and became so happy she shouted nearly all over the house. Esther was just a little woman, a short Dutch woman, but she was unable to contain the joy she experienced in Jesus that day. I have heard it said that whenever there was a cottage prayer meeting, my grandmother was often heard to shout for joy in Jesus. Since her sister had fulfilled her part in God's leading, Zelpy returned to her intercession with renewed strength. Each day, she would pray for a specific part of my father's body to receive help. She would first tell the family how she was going to pray, and God would answer according to her prayer. On the 3rd morning, she announced, "Eldon will call for something to eat within the next 24 hours. I'm going to pray for his appetite and his voice to return." All day she prayed. Then, that afternoon, a wonderful miracle took place. My father, who hadn't been able to speak or swallow for many days, whispered, "I would like some crackers and tea." My grandparents were beside themselves with joy. Since there was no tea in the house, and not a cracker was to be found either, William told Uncle Pete to saddle old Clyde, the same horse Dad was riding when he fell, and ride as fast as possible the 2 miles into Windsor for tea and crackers. Later that night, Grandfather was holding my daddy in his arms, thankfully feeding him crackers and tea. People came from around that area to see the boy who was a living miracle. As a very little girl, my mother can recall standing between the carriage wheels when her grandmother and Grandfather Dixon said, "We have just returned from seeing a little boy who was raised up from the edge of death by a life of trust and faith in Jesus." She later reminisced, "Little did I know that young boy would grow up to become my husband, the father of our 6 sons." God spoke a prophecy through Aunt Zelpy at the time of this miraculous healing. She declared, "This young man is going to be a man of God, and his faith, or that of his seed, will circle the globe." We are believing God to someday see this fulfilled by his grace and only for his glory.